So islands tend to hold a fascination for us as separate, special places that provide an escape from the ordinary world. They don't have to be surrounded by water. In the natural world, they can be any unique, isolated feature, like a desert oasis, an isolated topographical feature, or a rare ecosystem. For me, and maybe for many of us, they also provide a sense of having the world at your fingertips. They're places with clear boundaries that we feel that we can have complete knowledge of. Most islands aren't quite small enough for this completeness or boundedness or island-ness to be captured in one single vista. This sense can be captured by a standard map or an aerial photo, but you lose the sense of actually being there. So as I've shared in previous talks, virtual up till this one, I've tried to resolve this issue by creating a special kind of map that conveys the experience of a whole island all at once while preserving this sense of immersion. And I do this in watercolor by combining multiple views based on my own photography that are knitted together with aerial views to create a full unified sense of an island, and often heavily distorted like this to emphasize the most salient parts of my experience of the place. So it's this idea of simultaneous perspectives where the prepositions in my title come in. There could be many others in addition to these, of course. So in this talk, I'm going to dive into 3 recent works, each of them depicting a different kind of island. Different in terms of what defines them as islands, plus how they're experienced in real life and how I capture that experience on paper. So the first example is an ecological island. It's a desert oasis created not by groundwater, but by fog. This is Bosque Fray Jorge in Chile. It's in a range of coastal hills that rises about 500 meters above the surrounding desert to intercept the coastal fog layer. And the green doesn't come out very well in this aerial image, but you can see the scattered patches of forest along the north-south ridgeline that represent kind of the heart of the oasis. And zooming a bit closer in, you can see the boardwalk loop, which is about 1 kilometer long, weaving in and out of those forest patches. So the journey into the park starts in the desert lowlands, and you have this sense of approaching this special secret world ahead, hidden in the fog up above in the hills. As the road climbs, you start to see bromeliads mixed in with the cacti, and as you get higher, they grow denser and start to be mixed in with other moisture-loving shrubs. Reaching the boardwalk, you start to pass through these small patches of forest. And finally, you enter a really large patch where you feel like you're being enveloped by the foliage without any sense of the drier landscapes beyond. It's called a rainforest, but I think that's more because it has a lot of species in common with Chile's temperate rainforest region to the south. It actually doesn't get anywhere near enough rainfall to be truly considered a rainforest in that sense. So this particular oasis/island is not very discrete in the sense that the experience of the edge, quote-unquote edge, is more of a gradient from dry to lush. So in pencil sketches, I played around with how to capture this gradient by playing with the layout of the fragments and also blocking out the basic color range from beige to green. And you can see that I've accentuated that quite a bit compared to the aerial photo. And I obsessively tweaked the configuration to get just the right ratio of the different vegetation zones. You can see the forest zone, which is kind of in the center left, is much bigger than it is in reality, just to convey the sense of arrival and enclosure in those forest spaces. I also wanted to capture the sense of climbing or stepping upward into the hills and then spiraling inward to the forest, essentially a journey from bright and open to dark and enclosed. So back to those prepositions again. Essentially, you go from being around the island or beyond it or below it to on the island to finally in the island. So I then created a digital version to test the configuration with my actual photos and with the aerial fragments. You can see the beige to green transition doesn't read very well here. That's partly, again, based on what you saw in the aerial, partly because the lighting is not very consistent across the different pieces. Also because I was there during the less foggy season. During the foggiest part of the year, the landscape is much more lush in general than it is in these fragments. So in the watercolor, I accentuated, again, that green to beige or beige to green gradient as I did in the sketches. I also turned the composition 90 degrees because I think it made more sense to climb up into the hills from the bottom of the paper than from the right side. So here's the more precise travel route laid out on the watercolor. It actually traces segments of the road and the boardwalk that I've integrated into the fragments. And you can see how much that boardwalk loop in the upper left has been distorted to, again, emphasize the kind of salience of that forest experience. So this next example does involve an actual island surrounded by water, namely Maui. But my focus was on an ecological / geological island within that island, namely Haleakala crater at the summit. So more than Fray Jorge, Haleakala is defined by a sense of enclosure and separation from the world beyond. There are two sharply delineated experiences, namely inside and outside the crater. And these are the main trails inside the crater. It typically takes 3 days and 2 nights to hike into the crater and then around the trail system. You can see there are a few different ways to hike in, and then also 2 big gaps in the rim of the crater. So there is some hint of the world beyond. But again, unlike Fray Jorge, except for those forest fragments, the experience is more about enclosure in a special separate world rather than a gradual approach along a linear route. So inside the crater is mostly alpine desert, and it's actually a caldera because it contains many separate craters and cones. And so because of those multiple cinder cones and the desert landscape, it has a very lunar appearance. Moving toward the eastern side of the caldera, toward the windward side of Maui, the landscape becomes more lush and less lunar with pockets of native cloud forest vegetation, which are very rare elsewhere in Maui, or at least in places that are accessible. So this ecological diversity adds to a sense of the crater as a complete kind of separate world unto itself. Most of the crater is walled off by that rim, which is often hidden in the clouds. So again, contributing to that sense of being in kind of a special, hidden, separate world. Outside the crater, you have very little sense that that world exists, whether or not the mountain itself is actually visible. On the right here, looking at the Haleakala summit, it's even hard to believe that that's 10,000 feet of elevation. So in the sketches, I wanted to emphasize this sense of separation. And they started out as kind of a mess. It's really hard to pick up on the spatial relationships between inside and outside. It's easier to read in the digital mock-up version after I've reduced the number of pieces a little bit, but there's still a little bit too much going on. It's hard to get a sense of the crater as its own entity. Part of the issue is that to convey that sense of separation, I needed to include glimpses of and from the world beyond to show what the crater is actually separate from. And that includes views outward through the gaps and from the highest point on the rim, plus views of and from beyond the crater. So I took a few of those out, and that helped, I think, quiet things down a little bit. But in the watercolor, I realized I would need to emphasize the rim in the aerial views and continuing through a few of the landscape views. And also the horizon line in the views through the gaps, which interestingly read like an extension of the crater edge in some cases. You can see those kind of horizon lines there. So I think ultimately it worked out pretty well. Smoothing out the lighting and the color palette between the different pieces made a big difference. Interestingly, the light here is coming from the southeast, so alluding to some earlier talks, that is the wrong direction. I think it still reads like a crater, which is kind of an interesting thing, and I think it's probably an issue for a separate talk, but it kind of raises my curiosity. Probably having the water present changes the illusion a little bit. So final example is Isla Inkawasi, a rocky outcrop in the Salar de Uyuni, which is the world's largest salt pan at about 3,600 meters in the Bolivian Andes. Of the 3 examples, it's the closest to a traditional island because it's actually surrounded by water during part of the year when the salar floods and becomes what has been called the world's largest mirror. Like Haleakala, there's a sharp separation between island and everything beyond. But the contrast in color, texture, and terrain is much more evocative, I think, and surreal in its sharpness. So the salar is about 120 by 80 kilometers, and this gives you a sense of how big that really is. The island is a very tiny speck roughly in the center of it. It's about half a kilometer across, and there is a loop trail to the 150-meter summit, and that combined with a walk around the perimeter of the island takes, I don't know, a little over an hour to an hour and a half or so. So unlike Haleakala, nothing is hidden from view. Obviously, when you're standing next to the island really stands out. But there's also no sense of enclosure when you're on the island. The salar is always a very powerful presence, and often the edge of the island, or the coastline you might call it, is itself visible as it is here. Because the island is so small, and because the topo is so steep, the salt is not blocked by anything in the foreground unless you happen to be looking directly inland. So unlike Haleakala, there's more of a sense of being on the island than in the island. In the watercolor, I wanted to heighten this sharp contrast and this feeling of isolation, the smallness of the island compared to the vastness beyond. As you can see in the distance here, the landscape beyond the salt pan is visible. This is a volcano in the distance. But on the drive to and from the island, you have vistas like this, where the salt seems to go on forever. And this is the sense of the vastness that I wanted to capture. So in the watercolor, I ended up eliminating all those distant views of the landscape beyond the salt pan. I plan to leave a large percentage of the paper blank to represent kind of in an abstract way the salt pan from above. And in general, I imagine this work to be more abstract than the others, to be reflective of that evocative otherworldliness, its mirage-like quality, the sense that it's floating in midair. So I imagine it being much simpler with many fewer fragments to capture the basic impression of the place as an island and to depict space less literally and less completely than I usually do, while still conveying the spatial nature of the experience. Started out too busy, like the last one, partly because I got carried away with the idea of basing the compositional structure on polygonal patterns formed in the salt, which you saw in the earlier photo. So I took out the aerial views, and it having had the effect of making the cartographic aspect in this work even more purely conceptual than in the other works. Still too busy, I think, and I had the same challenge with the island to salt ratio, or the island to everything beyond ratio. I wanted to capture the smallness of the island, but also make it big enough to draw the viewer into the experience, to make you feel like you're standing on the island. So I got to where I wanted to be with the abstraction and with the island to salt ratio eventually. The title, Crystallized, references not only the salt crystals, but the idea of the island materializing out of nothing, like a mirage. So thank you. Most of my work does focus either on islands of various forms or edges more generally. So if you're into this train of thought, I love having conversations about these things, so please find me, visit my website. Also, there's a blog there where I get into these ideas in much more depth. So thanks again.